The wind coming off the East River was sharp in the winter of 1938, cutting through the wool coats of the crowds hurrying toward the municipal building in Lower Manhattan. It was a Tuesday, and the sky was a heavy, blanket gray, promising snow before the afternoon was out. The city was a machine of noise and motion-levitated trains screeching on the steel tracks above, the honking of taxicabs, and the relentless murmur of millions of people living their lives in close proximity. But inside the massive granite structure that housed the city's Department of Records, the atmosphere was one of muffled silence and permanence. This was a place of power, of decisions that shaped the infrastructure of the metropolis. But for the people who worked in the basement archives, it was simply a place of dust and paper. Thomas was a man of routine. At 42 years old, he had spent the last 2 decades in the sub-basement, tending to the city's history. He was a quiet man, slightly stooped from years of bending over filing cabinets, with spectacles that sat permanently on the bridge of his nose. He lived in a boarding house in Brooklyn and took the subway into Manhattan every morning, arriving at precisely 7:45 to unlock the heavy iron gates of the archive. His life was measured not in grand gestures but in the rhythmic turning of pages and the smell of aging ink. It was on a morning much like any other that the silent connection began. Thomas was waiting for the elevator, his arms laden with a stack of land deeds from the 1890s. The lift doors groaned open, and he stepped inside, followed closely by a woman he had seen only in passing. This was Marion. She worked in the typing pool on the 4th floor, a vast room filled with the rhythmic clatter of Underwood typewriters and the smell of carbon paper. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pinned back severely and hands that were always stained with ink. She wore the same uniform of sensible heels and a dark skirt, day after day. In the confined space of the elevator, there was a momentary pause in the world. They stood side by side, not touching, but close enough that Thomas could smell the faint scent of lavender soap that clung to her clothes. He nodded politely, a small, tight movement of his head, and she returned the gesture, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before she looked down at her gloves. It was a glance that held no words, yet it carried a weight of recognition. They were both small cogs in the vast machinery of the city, invisible to the department heads and the politicians above. But in that elevator, they saw each other. From that day on, their lives fell into a silent, unspoken rhythm. Every morning at 8 o'clock, Thomas would ride the elevator up to the ground floor to deliver outgoing mail, and every morning, Marion would step in on the 3rd floor to go to the typing pool. It was never planned, but it became the axis around which their days turned. They never spoke. The rules of the office and the social decorum of the time dictated a professional distance, and perhaps a shyness on both of their parts prevented them from breaking the barrier. But within those 60 seconds of travel, a language of glances and small gestures developed. Thomas began to adjust his schedule. If he saw her running down the hallway, he would pretend to fumble with his keys, holding the elevator door open just a second longer than necessary. Marion, in turn, would press the button for his floor if he was carrying a heavy box, saving him the effort of reaching across the control panel. These were tiny things, almost imperceptible to an observer, but to them, they were significant. They were the only breaks in the monotony of their duties. Their shared silence was filled with a quiet understanding. They knew the weariness in each other's eyes. They knew the ache of standing all day, the boredom of the repetitive tasks, and the loneliness of going home to empty rooms. In a city of millions, they had found a singular point of connection. As the months turned into a year, the routine deepened. The city outside the walls continued its relentless pace. The 1939 World's Fair opened in Flushing Meadows, painting the future in bright, hopeful colors. But down in the archives and the typing pool, time moved slower. There were days when the workload was overwhelming. Days when the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. On those days, the elevator ride was the only respite. One rainy afternoon in late autumn, a storm battered the windows of the building. The power flickered, and the elevators were slowed to a crawl. Thomas and Marion found themselves alone in the car, suspended between floors for a long moment. The air was thick with the sound of the rain against the glass shaft. Marion sighed, a soft, exhausted sound, and leaned her head back against the brass railing. Thomas looked at her reflection in the polished metal doors. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way she rubbed her thumb over her index finger, habit she had when she was tired. He wanted to tell her that the rain would stop, that the weekend was coming. He wanted to say that he noticed her hard work, that he admired her endurance, but the words stuck in his throat. They felt too large, too dangerous for the small space they occupied. So, instead, he shifted his weight, moving his umbrella to his other hand to create a little more room for her, a silent offering of comfort. Marian looked at him then, really looked at him, and a small, tired smile touched her lips. It was a gratitude that needed no explanation. In that stagnant air, between the hum of the machinery and the downpour outside, their secret affair of the heart unfolded, complete conversation, held entirely without words. The seasons changed, and the city prepared for a new decade. The atmosphere in the country was shifting. Talks of war in Europe were becoming more frequent, filtering down through the radio waves and into the lunchrooms. There was an undercurrent of anxiety in the city, a sense that the stability they knew was fragile. For Thomas and Marian, this looming uncertainty made their silent moments feel even more precious. They were a constant in a world that was preparing to change. Their feelings remained strictly internal, locked away behind the walls they built for themselves. Thomas would often lie in his bed at the boarding house, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Marian thought of him as he thought of her, wondering if she felt the same strange comforting warmth when the elevator doors slid open. He imagined what her voice sounded like in casual conversation, what she might say if they were walking down the street together, unburdened by the hierarchy of the office. But he never acted on these thoughts. To do so would be to break the spell, to risk the rejection or awkwardness that could shatter the only bright spot in his day. He respected the distance between them, a boundary defined by their stations and their own natures. By 1941, the war was no longer a distant rumor. The city was transforming. Men were leaving for service, and women were stepping into new roles, their uniforms changing, their expressions becoming harder, more determined. The Department of Records was busier than ever, dealing with the logistics of a city on a war footing. The quiet rhythm of the archives was disrupted by the influx of new files and the frantic pace of clerical work. The turning point came on a crisp Tuesday in November. The newspapers were full of headlines about the conflict overseas. But inside the building, the personal world of Thomas and Marian was about to shift. The elevator arrived at the ground floor, and as the doors opened, the usual crowd was waiting to get in. Thomas stepped out to make his way to the mailroom, but he paused. He felt a hand brush lightly against his sleeve, a fleeting touch, like the wing of a bird. He turned to see Marian standing in the open doorway of the elevator. She didn't speak, but she held a small, folded piece of paper. She didn't hand it to him. Instead, she simply placed it on the small brass shelf just inside the elevator door, where the logbook sat. And then she looked at him with a profound sadness in her eyes. The elevator operator shouted for people to make way, and the doors began to close. Thomas stood frozen in the marble lobby, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched the numbers climb above the door. He didn't follow her. He knew, with a sinking certainty, what the paper meant. He didn't need to read it to know that she was leaving. Perhaps she was moving to a defense plant out of state. Perhaps she was following family, or perhaps she had taken a war job in Washington, D.C. The city was emptying out and filling up all at once, and she was being carried away by the tide of history. He walked slowly back to the basement, his feet feeling heavy. The corridors seemed longer and darker than usual. When he reached the quiet sanctuary of the archive, he sat at his desk and unfolded the paper she had left. It was not a letter. It was a simple transfer form, already stamped and filed, a copy of her resignation. At the bottom, in her neat, precise handwriting, she had written 2 words, *thank you, *. Thomas stared at the handwriting. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise to write. It was an acknowledgement of what they had shared. She was thanking him for the doors held open, for the space made in the elevator, for the silent companionship that had made the long days bearable. She was thanking him for seeing her. He kept the paper. He didn't frame it or put it in a scrapbook. He slipped it into his wallet, between his identification card and a photograph of his parents. It stayed there, close to his heart, a thin layer of paper that held the weight of 3 years. Life in the city went on. The war continued, and the victory celebrations eventually came and went. The skyscrapers rose higher, the cars grew faster, and the noise of the city grew louder. Thomas continued his work in the archives. He rode the elevator every morning at 8 o'clock. He stood in the same spot, his back straight, his eyes forward. He held the door for other women, other men who hurried to their offices. But he never again felt that specific, silent click of connection that he had shared with Marian. Years passed. Thomas's hair turned grey, and then white. He eventually retired, collecting a gold watch and a handshake. He left the boarding house in Brooklyn and moved to a small apartment, spending his days walking in the park and reading the newspapers. He never married. There was no tragedy in it, no great heartbreak that kept him up at night. It was simply that he had experienced a moment of perfect understanding, a love that required nothing and gave everything, and he had never found a reason to settle for less. In his later years, he would sometimes sit by the window watching the rain fall over the city. Much like the day they had stood together in the stalled elevator, he would take out his wallet and look at the faded, brittle piece of paper with the words asterisk, thank you. Asterisk, the ink had turned brown, but the handwriting was still as elegant as he remembered. He realized then that their story was not a tragedy of separation, but a triumph of connection. They had lived in a world of strict rules and high walls, a world that tried to crush the individual spirit. Yet, within the cold stone corridors of power, they had carved out a private space of warmth and dignity. Their affair had truly unfolded behind those walls, not in the scandalous whispers of the gossip columns, but in the quiet dignity of two people who recognized something sacred in one another. It was a love story written not in grand speeches, but in the pause of a hand, the meeting of eyes, and the silence of a shared ride. It was as real as the city itself, built on the foundation of small, enduring things that history books often forget but the human heart always remembers. Thomas closed his eyes, listening to the sound of the rain, and in the darkness, he felt the presence of that ghost from the past, standing beside him once more, in the quiet, safe, and unspoken space between them.